Welcome back to another episode of the Gridiron Guys, and today we are going to be covering the opposite of our last video, and we're going to be doing the overvalued fantasy wide receivers for the next season. And I have three guys right now that I just don't want to draft in any of my leagues, no matter what the scoring type is, even if they're at a lower ADP. I just think that these guys are going to be complete, absolute busts, and I just don't want any shares of them in any of my leagues. And the first guy is a guy who used to be phenomenal, putting up dominant top 5 fantasy season numbers year in and year out. And his career has kind of just fallen off a cliff. He has some bad injury luck and now switched teams, and that is Odell Beckham Jr. And Odell back in the day was a phenomenal wide receiver. From a talent perspective, there was nobody better. And from a fantasy perspective, he was putting up double-digit touchdowns year in and year out with great yardage numbers and good receptions on a generally poor Giants offense. And I think part of the reason why his ADP, first of all, is so high is because we expect the Giants' Odell Beckham Jr. As fantasy owners, we look for guys who can win us leagues, and you look at Odell Beckham and you're like, he was a top 5 wide receiver, he can do it again. But those days are past him, and you have to realize that. In the last 3 years, Odell has 13 touchdowns. That's about 4 a year. He used to be putting up 13 in a season. I mean, he saw 133 targets last year. People might be like, oh, Cleveland has too many mouths to feed. Well, last year, Odell got 133 targets, which is plenty to finish as a wide receiver 1, and he finished as the wide receiver 31 for the year. And I think he's going to finish lower than wide receiver 31 this year. He's played 2 full seasons in his 6 career years, missing significant chunks of times throughout his career. And this all is already bad news, and what hurts him even more is Kevin Stefanski is taking over to run the Cleveland Browns offense, and he just ran the Minnesota offense, and we saw how much they ran the ball. They have a full season of Kareem Hunt now with Nick Chubb, and they're going to be a run-first team. No matter how many pass-catching options they have, this is a run-first team in the Cleveland Browns. And I just think that Odell's targets are going to go down from 133. Not only do they have a run-first play caller, they also got Austin Hooper to pair with David Njoku in the middle, which will definitely take some more targets. Jarvis Landry is a very competent wide receiver too. It's going to be a run-first team, and when they pass, there's a lot of competition for targets in the Cleveland Browns offense. And to add to that, Odell Beckham is injury-prone. He's missed a ton of time in the last few years. And we saw what he did last year, wide receiver 31. And somehow he's not even being drafted close to wide receiver 31. He's being drafted as around wide receiver 15 to 20 in most, I would say, leagues, depending on scoring. He's going to see a decrease in targets. And I understand. I still think he's a very talented player, but I think Cleveland is not the place, if he ever unlocks that old Odell Beckham, it's not the place you're going to see it, and it's definitely not this year. Even at wide receiver 31, I don't like Odell Beckham. I would draft DK Metcalf, Calvin Ridley, Devontae Parker, DJ Chark all over Odell Beckham, because I'm not even sure the guy's going to finish with 1,000 yards. Last year, he played a full year for what Odell Beckham usually plays. Maybe missed 1 game or 2 games, and he barely put up 1,000 yards. This year, they're going to be running the ball a ton more. Kareem Hunt is there. Austin Hooper is there. I mean, Odell is set to disappoint on last year's season, and last year's season was a massive disappointment. He was being drafted as a high second-round pick last year and was a complete bust. This year, being drafted as a 3rd or 4th round pick, people didn't learn their lesson, and once again, he's going to be a massive bust. I wouldn't even draft him in the 6th, maybe even 5th round, because he's not going to be good. But some people are going to say, oh, it's Odell Beckham, how can you not take a chance? Because there's plenty of other wide receivers who have far better upside with a much higher floor. Odell has such a low floor because he gets hurt all the time, and I don't want an injury-prone, overhyped player on my team. The Odell Giants days are past. He's not going to be putting up wide receiver 1 numbers, so don't draft him as a wide receiver 1. As a flex, okay, fine. Even as a wide receiver 2, Odell was not good last year. He wasn't startable sometimes because That's how bad he was. He lost confidence. He could barely start in certain games. I mean, Odell Beckham Jr. is just overhyped and just not a guy you want on your rosters anymore in fantasy football. It's as simple as that. And now we have another guy who I feel for because he is a great player, but he's in a terrible scenario, and that is Keenan Allen. He's a target monster over the last 3 years, finishing with 136 plus targets in the last 3 seasons. And that's largely in part to Phillip Rivers. He is a gunslinger. He throws that ball deep. He had a great rapport with Keenan Allen. Now we have Tyrod Taylor and Justin Herbert, and that is a huge difference. There's one thing I like to stay away from in wide receivers. It's when they switch QBs because you can't project what's going to happen. Always stay with wide receivers who are returning to the same QB. And Keenan Allen is not. Right now he's being drafted as the wide receiver 19, and that is extremely high. I think that he will barely finish as a top 35 wide receiver this year. He will struggle to get consistent play because his QB is going to be so lackluster. His quality of targets is set to go down. His target share is set to go down. There's no way Tyrod Taylor throws the ball to Keenan Allen over 136 times. I see around 100 to 110. I mean, he finished as wide receiver 11 last year, which was a great season. But I don't even think he has top 20 upside because they're going to be... Justin Herbert will probably play at one point or another, and I don't think he's going to be very good whatsoever. He might be better than Tyrod because he might throw the ball down the field. But with Hunter Henry and Mike Williams competing for targets, I expect all those guys to be very mediocre fantasy options this season. And I don't think I want any of them, but Keenan Allen's draft price is way too high. Wide receiver 19 is just terrible. I mean, you can be getting guys like Robert Woods, who I mentioned in a previous video, in the undervalued because Robert Woods has a great floor and a great ceiling. Keenan Allen has a very low floor and a okay ceiling. I mean, it's just, I see regression, and I feel like people right now are thinking he can outplay bad QBs. But over the course of fantasy football, and I've looked at players who've been able to outperform bad QBs, and there's not many. Deandre Hopkins might be the sole player who can do that. Tyrod Taylor is going to drastically bring Keenan Allen down to a low-end wide receiver option who will only be able to survive based on volume, and if the volume is not there, it's going to be very tough sledding for Keenan Allen because he can't be a consistent option like Tyler Lockett on 90 to 100 targets. That's very difficult to do because Russell Wilson is throwing those passes, not Tyrod Taylor. It's as simple as targets are going to be less, targets are going to be worse, and there's going to be competition for targets with Mike Will and Hunter Henry, and not to mention Austin Eckler is a great receiving back, and as we tend to see when new QBs come in, they throw to the pass-catching running back. That's an easy completion. Keenan Allen is a guy who's going to be drawing a top corner every week, and it's just not a guy I want to be drafting this year. He's in for some regression, and I think he could have a very disappointing season, as did Odell Beckham last year. Both are just way overrated and not guys I want on my roster. And lastly, we have another wide receiver with a new QB, and that is Tyler Boyd. And some may say Joe Burrow is going to bring the Cincinnati Bengals offense to be electric. And he very well could be, but I don't think it's going to be this year. If Tyler Boyd didn't have so many weapons around him, I may have more faith in him to do well. But with the likes of John Ross, T. Higgins, A.J. Green, and Auden Tate as surrounding wide receivers, he is going to be competing for a ton of targets this coming year. And I don't think they're going to be a high-volume passing option with Joe Mixon out of the backfield. I think they're going to be a very average passing offense. Last year, Tyler Boyd finished as the wide receiver 25, and he needed 148 targets to do so. 148 targets is a top 5 wide receiver opportunity, and Tyler Boyd finished as the wide receiver 25. I mean, no matter how bad your QB play is, if you make 148 targets into wide receiver 25, not even a wide receiver 2 for the year, I mean, that's very bad production. He only had 1,048 yards on 148 targets. This year, he's going to be having to compete for targets. His targets are going to go way down, probably around 100, losing 48 targets on the year. Joe Burrow may see an uptick in production, but is Boyd going to even eclipse 1,000 yards this year? I don't think so. I mean, he'll need touchdowns to be relevant. he's not going to be a consistent option because there are so many weapons. I mean, it's hard to project which of these guys are going to do well. As the year goes on, T. Higgins will probably carve out more of a role. If A.J. Green and John Ross stay healthy, Tyler Boyd may be the guy that's suffering from all of this because A.J. Green is a guy who is dominant when he's on the field. John Ross is a slot guy. T. Higgins was a high draft pick, essentially a first-round pick, picked very high in the second round. I mean, he's going to be coming for Tyler Boyd's slot as the year goes on, and I'm just very, very skeptical to draft Boyd this year because I think he's going to have to struggle for a lot of targets. If he doesn't play well early on, he's going to be a very poor play down the line, and I think he's almost going to be unstartable to an extent, and Tyler Boyd is not a player I want to be drafting this year because he's a good wide receiver. He is a solid wide receiver 2 to pair with a great wide receiver 1, but obviously Cincinnati doesn't have faith in their wide receiver core, drafting a wide receiver with the first pick of the second round. I mean, Auden Tate is also a decent wide receiver. He got a lot of targets last year. I just think Boyd is not going to break 1,000 yards this year. I see around 800 yards as a very confident projection. And as 800 yards, he's not going to come close to wide receiver 25. He'll probably be around wide receiver 35 to 40. I think I'd much rather take a chance on A.J. Green or John Ross, guys who have much higher upside if they can stay healthy than Tyler Boyd. And I believe Tyler Boyd is being drafted way over both of those guys right now. And I just don't understand it. Tyler Boyd is not a guy I want to be drafting in any of my leagues. And that's it for the video. I think these 3 guys stood out to me as the most overrated wide receivers in this year's fantasy football drafts because there's just too much hype and their ADPs are so overinflated, and it's just, I will not have one of these players on my roster unless they fall 5 or 6 rounds, because you can never say I'll never draft a player because Odell Beckham in the 12th round is a good value, but he's not going to drop to the 12th round. I mean, at their current ADP and where they'll be drafted, these are guys I do not want to touch. I don't even want to look at them on my roster. I'll be crossing them off my draft boards because I know I'll be in no position to draft them at any point throughout this year's fantasy drafts. And stay tuned in the next coming few days because I'll be moving to my undervalued running backs and overvalued running backs. I think these are great videos to understand because these videos help you see the players that are presenting good value and bad value compared to some big names out there. And make sure to leave a comment below. Do you think the likes of Tyler Boyd, Odell Beckham, and Keenan Allen are going to be bust this year? Or do you think that I am completely wrong and they're going to play pretty well compared to their ADP? Let me know. And make sure to like and subscribe as always and follow us on our socials at Insta. And our Insta username is Gridiron_Guys_YT. So make sure to go drop a follow and check our content out. And stay tuned for upcoming running back videos.